Good morning and welcome to this Friday, September the 4th version of From Sunrise to Sunset with Pastor Gene. We're going to be looking at the parable chapter today, Matthew 13, and we're going to try to do this in 2 days. Today we're going to be looking at the first 4 parables, which are parables to a general audience of listeners, and then we're going to be looking at tomorrow at the other 3 parables in this chapter, which are directed primarily toward the disciples. So let's begin. In the parable of the sower, Jesus is again talking about, in this parable, about the seeds that are sown that fall on different kinds of ground. Now remember what I said recently in a sermon, the seeds are all good. The seeds are all good. It's the soil they fall into that determines what the yield is going to be from those seeds. So if there's rocky ground, we need to get rid of the rocks. If there's thorns, we need to get rid of the thorns. If we're just falling along the path, then we need to find the fertile soil for those seeds to take root and to grow and to produce good things, because the seed is good. The problem's not with what we have been given. The problem's not with what we are created to be. The problem is the kind of soil that that God's seeds fall into. We need to make sure that it's good soil, because the seed that God gives us is good. Jesus then goes into some of an explanation of using the parables, because the parables are stories that kind of contemporary style resonate in the ear of the hearer. That's what we do in homiletics. That's what we do in sermons. You know, all sermons are supposed to be biblically based, but they are all relevant because they're biblically based and they relate to something going on in our ecclesial context. He goes on to explain the parable of the sower and the seed in verses 18 through 23. Then he brings up the parable of the weeds among the wheat. And there has to be a separation of the things that are good and not good. There has to be a separation of the things that are good versus the things that are evil, the things that choke the life out of what we do. And that is going to happen. Again, accountability is a huge issue here in Matthew. Accountability to obedience to what Christ is calling us to do, because indeed that's the message of the old, that connection between the old in the Old Testament, how faith was so dependent on obedience. Same thing is true here in Matthew, only it's being fulfilled in the life of Jesus. But what he does in this parable of the wheat and the weeds, they are separated. The wheat's taken into the barn, part of the harvest, and the weeds are gathered and burned. Then the parable of the mustard seed, where the smallest of seeds, and at that time it was known to be the smallest of seeds, can yield a great shrub, become a great tree, so that the birds of the air can make their nest in this tree. So from something very small, something very great can happen. And then the parable of the yeast, where the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. A woman was viewed as an agent of the kingdom at making bread, having a large impact with small beginnings. And it's interesting that Jesus uses a woman to make this illustration at a time when many people didn't think women were all that important in the culture. Let me be very clear about something that I have always believed. God calls who God calls. God calls men and women to ministry. And it's not about the gender, though some have made it that way. God uses all of us to promote, to build, to preach, to expand his kingdom. And that's kind of what the yeast does. It helps expand the flour so that it can be bread. Jesus goes on to explain the parables even more in verses 36 through 43. He also, let me back up a little bit to verse 35. He quotes a verse there from the Psalms that justifies the use of the parables. I believe that's Psalm 78:2. And I love the way he tells these parables and then says, let anyone with ears listen. So, you're hearing these words and from sunrise to sunset. You're hearing these words from Matthew. Are you hearing Jesus say, if anyone has ears, listen? It's not just during these videos or during your private time of reading, but it's from sunrise to sunset. Tomorrow we'll talk about the parables to the disciples.